Welcome to the Clause YouTube channel.
Together, we strive for a safer, secure, and more stable world.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Strategic Frontlines, the Clause official YouTube channel. We have today with us Ambassador Yogendra Kumar, retired. He was our ambassador to Philippines and Tajikistan and High Commissioner to Namibia. He is an author of many books, and his latest being Geopolitics in the Era of Globalization, Mapping an Alternative Global Future. We have with us Lieutenant General Dushyant Singh, PVSM, AVSM retired. He's the Director General of Clause and the author of Grey Zone Warfare, Way Ahead for India. We'll also be joined by Lieutenant General VP Singh, AVSM, YSM retired. He specializes on national security and strategic affairs related to South Asia. I welcome all of you to this podcast. And today we will be discussing the power play in South Asia and how it is going to impact India, or whether it will impact. As we know that US has increased its engagement with Bangladesh, and the US delegation had met Yunus when he took over, as also very recently this month, American US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, as I was talking about, the US, they have increased the engagement with Bangladesh, and the US delegation had met Yunus when he took over, as also recently this month, American US Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke with Yunus, and they discussed, amongst other things, trade and the security in the Indo-Pacific. Now, US engagement with Pakistan, we know of late, it has been, if we talk the events, how it has taken place, we know that there was cryptocurrency, then the Munir lunch was there, and then finally, it was alleged that Pakistan have a major role to play in the Iran-Israel war. If you see the other major power, that is China. China is also trying to have its say in South Asia. China, Pakistan, nuclear fusion, we already know. But China is also trying to make its presence felt in Bangladesh. And further, the threesome, that is China, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, had a trilateral meeting in China in June. Now, this can be construed in three ways. Firstly, China is trying to strengthen its strategic axis in IOR on both the eastern and the western flank, because we know it's trying to modernize the Bangladesh Mongola port, and its naval presence can be seen in the Bay of Bengal. Secondly, through BRI, it's trying to enrich the economy of both the countries. And thirdly, it is building Bangladesh airbase, where surprisingly Pakistani subcontractors are going to be there. It has been alleged. On the other side, Bangladesh is joining Pakistan in the naval exercise. So there is a clear pattern which is emerging as far as China is concerned. So my first question is to Ambassador Yogendra Kumar. How do you see these patterns, and what India needs to do?
I think we, as the foremost power in South Asia, we need to actually monitor these developments very closely. There is no doubt about that. But I also think we did not overreact on that. The reason, of course, is that Pakistan is in a bad shape, economically and politically. And Bangladesh actually has an interim government, where you find that the relations between the interim head of the head of the interim government, that is Mohammed Yunus, and the Bangladesh Chief of Army Staff, the relations is not very good. And Bangladesh actually still trying to stabilize, but I think it's going about in the wrong way. But the fact of the matter is that both these countries are themselves finding themselves mired in their own internal problems so much that their ability to actually try to tilt the power equilibrium in South Asia without anybody's support. I think it is something which we should not actually exaggerate. As far as China is concerned, there's a recent Lowy Institute report, which is very interesting, that because of state of affairs inside China, it described China as the world's biggest debt collector. What it means is that whatever investments the Chinese have made, it's a very complicated kind of a process by which they've gone about it. In infrastructure, which are long gestation, high capital intensive investments, they have actually not fructified to the extent that they are thinking of doing. So whether it's Bangla Port or whether it is Gwadar or whether it's Hambantota or whatever, different places. The fact of the matter is that their potential in any strategic sense should not be overrated in my view. That is the main point. The other thing, I think it applies largely to any big power wanting to see the strategic situation in South Asia. And that is that India actually is a very big power, undoubtedly, economically and politically stable and militarily uh, powerful. So India's role is not seen by these countries in terms of, let's say, South Asia. It is seen in global terms. And therefore, the calculations change a lot in that. Now, of course, we talked about President Trump. Undoubtedly, he's somewhat of unusual kind of a political figure. His politics quite different. He himself says my politics different from the rest of the American politicians. So let us wait and see. I mean, what exactly he might be expecting out of this. But the fact of the matter is that no power, whether it is US or Russia or China, whichever country, can actually ignore that India is not a factor to be taken into account in whatever strategic pursuits they actually are trying to follow. So that basically is my large point. And I mean, naval exercise and all these things go on. But again, the Bay of Bengal, frankly speaking, is very much an area where we are, in fact, rather in a better position. In the Western Indian Ocean, again, I would actually say that after the U.S. Navy, the Indian Navy is the most powerful presence in this area. So, the little games keep going on. But, I think we still have to see that, as I said, we have to watch trends very carefully without, as I said, over interpreting that. In my view, the bigger challenge for India actually is that its periphery, the immediate proximity, actually is ringed by countries which are in different stages of fragility. And that is the own dynamic. That's something that we have to understand, whether it's Pakistan in a fragile position, Bangladesh, whether it's Myanmar. So they have the dynamic changes very much in contrast with countries which are actually much more stable because they have a different kind of agency. So that's my broad point, but I want to hear the other distinguished analysts.
Jal Dushyant Singh, I would like to get you in and I would like to hear your views. What are your views as far as China is concerned and the US is concerned, both their roles in South Asia? And especially, do you think US will have some kind of a long-term interest in Bangladesh?
Well, first of all, a warm welcome to all our guests for this particular YouTube discussion. As far as South Asia is concerned, there seems to be a big power rivalry which has started off in the region. And this I say so because of a number of factors. Now, if you see Pakistan, there has been some kind of a reach out to America where they have struck a number of deals, whether it is related to cryptocurrency, whether it is related to Balochistan minerals, or even for that matter, Pakistani militaries good relationship which they enjoy with the CENTCOM and the U.S. Army officers and the Defense Air Force officers, because they regularly keep in touch with each other in terms of number of courses which they do. Even I believe in the bases in the West Asia and Middle East, we were having an informal talk, and the former ambassador was also mentioning that there may be Pakistani officers posted there, like the Pakistanis have officers in the Chinese headquarters in Western Theatre Command. So there is a certain amount of greater relationship of the Pak army officers vis-a-vis the US. And I have seen this personally also. I've been in number of courses in the United States of America myself. I've done one long course of 1 year and 8 months, 1 year and 6 months, which was in which I saw this kind of a relationship there existing between the Pakistani officers and the US military officers. So there has been, I think, recalling of that relationship which is taking place as far as Pakistan is concerned. Leave aside the lunches and other things; those are
Yes.
at the diplomatic
Minor.
level. I'm talking at military level, at the warfare level. So,
Yes.
why has this come about? In my opinion, possibly because number of equipment of Chinese have failed in this particular Operation Sindhu, because of which they have probably felt the need for diversification, as also containing India through other powers. So the US also had the need for containing China. I mean, it's no brainer. Everybody knows that US wants to contain China. How best can it control China? It has no access in Iran. It has no access in Central Asia. It has no access with Russia, and it has relatively zero access in the Southeast Asia also, except for Singapore and some Philippines, etc., which are far away from this part of the world of Chinese attempts to get into the Indian Ocean region. So you have Bangladesh and Myanmar on the right, on our eastern flank, and Pakistan on the western flank as the two inroads which America wants to do, and therefore I say that it is an accidental convergence of interests which has happened, in which India has been caught in the vortex. That means there is a Chinese interest of containing or keeping India at bay, because it doesn't want India to grow at the same pace and become a challenge for China in the future. They are looking at it at a long term view of that. The Americans are looking at China because China is its primary interest. India can help them out, may not help them out, but the flanks from which the Chinese can enter into Indian Ocean, Malacca Strait is very well taken care of. Lunda is very well taken care of. Sunda is very well taken care of. All these straits are the places from where China can enter, and our Indian Navy is capable of holding them on. And if you add the fixed aircraft carrier, which is Andaman Nicobar, as and when we make it into a kind of a aircraft carrier type of a military base, uh, it's a no-go for China as far as getting out of South China Sea is concerned. It will have to depend on the Gwadar and Djibouti and Sri Lanka and Maldives as its outstations or military bases. But to reach there, it needs to go through that. So CPEC and CMEC become very important, and it is because of this that they have announced this under the UN garb, of course, humanitarian corridor going through Bangladesh. You see that humanitarian, till now, what were they doing about the Rohingyas or the people who were
Yes.
suffering because of the Arakan Army's actions against the military junta, or military junta's action against the rebel groups there? Suddenly, they have thought of this, humanitarian corridor. Bangladesh chief is against this humanitarian corridor. It's Yunus who is a pro-US guy who is trying to push this issue. Similarly, on the Pakistani front, Trump's son came there, and he struck all those deals. Maybe the deals are just a cover to get inside, or Pakistan is also playing a double game of keeping China and US against each other. If the US presence is there, then the Chinese are also restricted in their manipulation of Pakistan. So I think Pakistan is trying to play a very smart game, and suddenly they have also started raising the issue of a South Asian grouping, which includes China, and by no stretch of imagination we can include China in the South Asian group.
Absolutely.
China is not a South Asian
South Asian.
country, say to speak. So therefore, what they're trying to do is isolate India by
Yes.
what I have read through in various articles is that they will give out a formal invite to India to also join. But India will not join with if China is there in this kind of a grouping. So we have to actually strengthen our own diplomacy here, through BIMSTEC and the other forums which we have. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a big power game going on around India, and how this big power game pan out in the future is something which we need to watch militarily, because that will have an impact on our defense procurements. That will have an impact on our alliances, which are not alliances, the partnerships and the agreements which we have with the US, as also with the other Western countries. Because you see, in the short term, it has to be a mixed strategy for India as far as our capability building of military capability building is concerned. Because I am of the opinion that unless you have a strong military power, your presence at the international level is limited.
Limited.
uh, I believe in रामधारी सिंह दिनकर's poem कि शक्ति के बिना कुछ नहीं हो सकता है, शक्ति जिसके पास है वही क्षमा दे सकता है. So therefore I don't want to repeat that full paragraph of क्षमा सोबती उस भुजंग को जिसके पास गरल हो, हाँ, उसको क्या जो विषहीन हो दंतहीन हो विनीत और नरम हो. So we cannot have that kind of a thing. And Ramdhari Singh Dinkar was a very, very, I would say, docile poet. He used to be
Yes.
always on the, he was some kind of a socialist in his attitude. Even he had to acknowledge this kind of a thing. So therefore, for India, it's challenging times, but nothing which India can't take care of. You must remember that India's military has grown quite a bit. India's economic heft has increased. We are now going to be the third largest power, economic power, because of the country, because of the simple reason Germany, which is ahead of us, is growing at 1%. We are growing at 6%, so 6.5 or 7%. So it will not take us more than 1.5 year to surpass Germany. So overall, we are a power to reckon with. We need to play our cards well and keep these smaller nations around us on board through incentives, through outreaches, and not keep them get them away from our sphere of influence. And we are always known for our world is one family kind of a diplomacy. We should be able to get. After all, we can quote the example of Sri Lanka, where we were the first ones to actually give them the guarantee for the release of IMF money. So these things should be projected in the environment much more loudly, much more forcefully, to tell our neighbors that, look, your future lies with India and not with others. They will listen to you provided you have the economic and the military heft with you, and for which we need to work upon. I think I will stop here and request you to take the discussion forward. With only last comment, which I would like to say here is that we also need to be prepared for the worst case scenario, which I will paint the scenario, and I'll request response from
So,
Ambassador
yes.
Yogendra ji and General VP Singh. From him, the diplomatic response, and from General VP, military response. So over to you, Dr. Roshan.
Okay. Thank you, General Singh. General Singh rightly pointed out that we need to be militarily very strong, because if you see, China also says that the power flows from the gun. So we need to be militarily strong. There's no doubt about it. I would like to bring in General VP Singh. And I want to ask you, how do you think we need to calibrate our approach as far as South Asia is concerned? You have been listening to General Singh, and we were discussing before you joined, we were discussing the US and China's influence in South Asia. So, what are your views? What approaches we need to take, and how we need to ensure that all other nations are. You
I
need to
think
unmute.
You're mute, sir.
Okay.
again,
Again, you're
please.
mute. You're mute again. Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. So, as far as this great power uh, entry or competition in the South Asia is concerned, it's no brainer. Actually, it's something which should have been expected, because these policies have been worked on for a long, long, long time. Now, how it impinges on India, firstly, like, as you know, India aspires to be a big power in times to come. We are working hard, rising slowly and steadily. Now, when that happens, obviously, a country which is on the rise requires strategic space. And what better place than to around your own periphery and the sea borders that you have to grow beyond. And the first ring of countries that you need to influence are the countries which are just around you on your periphery. That is exactly where the contestation steps in. Our geography tells us that we are not in a very happy state vis-a-vis geographical demands are concerned. China to our north and Pakistan to our west is enough competition for us to remain engaged. However, as we are all aware that we have chosen a policy of strategic autonomy, not now, even early years when we were not very powerful, not very, our voice was not very strong, even those days we started with the plan of non-alignment when the world was divided in blocks. So we consciously stayed away from the bloc politics. We tried to steer our own course and we tried to create our own space and our area of influence. That has been our philosophy. In 2025, we are still working on the same principle, on the same path. So what happens is now the big powers like China, like USA, because of the enhanced power that they command, there is a need for them to project that power. As far as China is concerned, both Indian Ocean region as well as the northern borders are the spaces where they would like to exert their power on India. Americans, for their reasons, what I was listening to the discussion, views of the previous two speakers, they are trying to challenge China, and they have chosen to deal with China in IOR. Apart from the Pacific, that of course is very much part of that. It is in the IOR that India comes in play. Now, here we have a little conflict. One, our own priority of strategic autonomy, not being part of any grouping or bloc. And two, the pressure which comes upon us to choose. Now, we have to play this game very smartly in the sense that while we gather our strength, we need to keep our periphery quiet. We need to keep our international environment around India harmonious. At the same time, we need to have full preparedness to deal with any threat which may come upon as we advance further. Now, what we have seen in the last couple of months or years now, that this jumping straight onto the military conflict, I don't think it's going to be a order herein onwards. And you know, when I recall Prime Minister's advice to President Putin that this is not an era of war, I read it a little differently. And how I read it is this, that perhaps wars are not going to give the objectives those nations they set for themselves. More often than not, they will remain inconclusive. More often than not, they will cause enormous degradation of economic power of the parties involved. And at the end of the day, no matter how long you fight, you have to come back to the peace negotiation. You have to come back to the table to resolve the matters. And therefore, I think India is very wisely choosing the path to avoid confrontation, avoid getting entangled with any of the big powers, steer the middle course, and keep its periphery and the external and internal environment harmonious. To my mind, India's policy in this regard is pretty steady, notwithstanding the euphoria which has just set in post-Op Sindoor, and our westerly neighbor is going to the town with all kind of victory marches and things like that. But that's a very, very short-term and very myopic idea or view. I think we are on the right lines and we are pursuing a policy which is well-founded and well analyzed. This is the way to go as far as our future or progress towards the new world is concerned. Thank you.
I would like to bring in Ambassador Yogendra Kumar. Ambassador Yogendra Kumar, we were talking about Indo-Pacific. General Singh also mentioned, General Dushyant Singh also mentioned. So, do you feel that there is a kind of a churning which is going on in the Indo-Pacific? Because on one side we have Quads, we have AUKUS. On the other side, there is also China, Russia, and Iran. They also had their security belt exercise. And for the last 2 years, I think they have called Pakistan as an observer. So China is trying to increase its presence as far as in Indian Ocean region is concerned. Now, what are your views? Firstly, do you think that with the coming of Trump, will Quad as influential as it was initially, or it will it will die out little bit till the time he's there? Or do you think that China, how is it going to maneuver itself in the Indian Ocean region? Because whatever said and done, as General Dushyant Singh also mentioned, the geography does not help them. But they have made a lot of outposts in the Indian Ocean region. So
Right.
how do you think this thing is going to
So I
impact?
will make just one or two preliminary points because General Dushyant Singh actually specifically asked me to address that issue. That is our diplomatic response to the various scenarios which are coming up. Now, my starting point here is this: that the world turbulence is so much, the turmoil is so much that it is very difficult to look at the evolution of the world situation in linear terms. I mean, you talk about the rate of growth, you talk about trade figures, and you talk about population figures, and whatever. But you would notice that all predictions have gone wrong if you think about it from that point of view. And when we talk in terms of influence, what is influence? How does influence uh, gets factors into power equilibrium, for example? Then we actually have to start thinking a little differently. And there, actually, I do agree with General Singh. You see, and I give you an example. You see, today's situation in the Middle East, if you take, uh, when Americans moved to Afghanistan, I was ambassador in Tajikistan. There were 15,000 troops, CIA and some expeditionary forces, and they took over the country. 15,000 troops. Then the Americans thought, well, if we can take over a country in 15,000 with 15,000 troops, let's go to Iraq. So then they go into Iraq. And you have Iran in a pincer. So you have Afghanistan on one side, Iraq on the other side, the Americans are present. The Iranians send a message to the Americans to say that we will discuss everything you want. They want to discuss everything you want, our nuclear program, our activities in the Middle East or wherever. But please do not talk in terms of regime change. That's all they wanted. Americans rebuffed them. What is all this? So what happens then? After some time, Iran collapses, right? So the ISIS-SL develops, Levant ISIL develops. And who are these people? And they spread their tentacles. Then you find that the power balance there shifts because Iran is a very large country in the Middle East, in the Gulf region. So the power equation started to shift. Then you find Afghanistan collapsing. Okay, they've got into bad shape at the height of the American operation, the surge under General Petraeus. The number of American and international troops was as much as it was when the Soviets were in Afghanistan. The same number of troops, that much. So you see how the 15,000 troops had gone that far. Now, when that happens, you find the power equation changes. Then you find what the Iranians call the axis of resistance. Then you find the Al-Quds force, right? And that continues. Now, then you see what all is happening, whether you see in Gaza, you see in Lebanon, you see in Syria, and wherever, the tables again change. And you find now Iran in diminished position. Now, just think about it. If at that time, let's say the American leaders had thought in more strategic terms, not pure military terms, perhaps the shape of the Middle East would have been quite different. And I give one more example. We talk about this kind of, what is the comparison between the American forces and the Afghan forces, the Taliban? As I said, Americans, when they lost at that time, their figures have come out. 5 people were lost at that time. 4 were killed by mistake, 1 in friendly fire. At the end of 20 years, Americans lost 5,000 own troops. Forget about Afghanistan, 5,000 own troops. $4 trillion the money they spent there. And how did they leave Afghanistan? So the question actually is that you actually have to think in terms, when you talk about influence, influence can be exercised many ways. And that is how we have to look at the entire spectrum. Like General Singh talked about, Prime Minister saying about this era of peace and not war, when the conflict should be faced, there are bigger decisions. But there are other ways by which you can expand your influence, and you can actually prevent people or other countries from trying to manipulate. Now, countries which are weak can be manipulated far more easily than countries that are strong. But the country is fragile. I mean, if the Americans try to manipulate Afghanistan, I mean, what manipulation can they actually do? Or the Pakistan, they rain Cuba, because the country is fragile. So same logic applies everywhere. So my point really here is this, that you have these things, people try to take advantage of this, that, and the other. But the fact of the matter is that there are many ways, like again the example of Sri Lanka is a good example. And the case of Bangladesh, I think they began on a wrong wicket, on a wrong foot. But if they had been, and we have been sending messages to them that look, we are prepared to work with you at one point. And you have to see how you can go about it. But if you come up with a sense of vendetta or a sense of revenge, then you are actually harming your own interests, because you are an unstable country. You have an intelligent government. You don't have a system of elections. You don't have a judicial system working. You don't have police system working, and you are basically bankrupt. Now, in that sort of affairs, what can they expect from the Chinese? How much can the Chinese invest in that area? And let me tell you this: there was a discussion, public discussion. I remember a former chief of naval staff saying, "How much I can take out in no time?" Very for the Indian Navy. It's bother for Indian Navy. So, that's why this balancing is very, very important. And my final point about diplomacy and various options is basically this, and I like this particular approach the Americans have. Because the US National Intelligence Council, what they do is that every 20 years, for every 4 years, they make a forecast for every 20 years, next 20 years. So what it means is that they report they write after 4 years, before they actually revisit their thoughts, their presuppositions in the previous report. And then they keep on correcting themselves. So the point here is that when we look at our strategic scenario building, we actually have to think in terms as to how these things are developing in different places, watch the micro trends, have the capacity to analyze them, and take preventive action. You can do that. A lot of preventive action you can take that. You can take instead of, and I have to say, some of our diplomats have written, actually the book I'm working on, I've quoted diplomats who said that we have mishandled, we misread situation in Sri Lanka, for example. One example I can give: we misled, misinterpreted, and wrongly, misread the situation in Nepal. So there are many ways in which you can go about in expanding your influence and making sure that these countries are actually friendly towards you. Myanmar, again, a very good example. The country is broken. I don't know when the country will become ever stable. 100 years? Will China have the capacity to stabilize Myanmar? They don't have the capacity. They're actually facing the blowback from Myanmar into China. And we are actually finding on our northeast. So I would actually say that when we talk in terms of our strategic options, it has to be a continuing exercise where we develop the capacity for metadata, artificial intelligence, and then to bring up all these things together to actually watch the micro picture as it emerges. And we can then take a lot of action. Which country is interested in an unstable Bangladesh? It's a very large country. Who can stabilize it? Can USA stabilize it? Can China stabilize it? Not at all. They don't have so much of money. None of them have so much of money. So what I'm saying, that is the main point, because then you find your capacities are built. Analytical capacities, your data, you're able to assess it better, in which case you can then work out your diplomatic options, you can work out your military options, you can work out your other, there's so many other strategic options that you have, which you can exercise. You can do it. Yeah, thank you.
General Dushyant Singh, I would like to call you here, and I would like to ask you, as Ambassador Yogendra Kumar was saying, do you feel that we lack a strategic planning as far as our foreign affairs and things like that is concerned? Or do you think we have what you call it? We lack a long-term planning, or we do a knee-jerk reaction, that kind of a thing? And secondly, how can we increase our what you call it influence in the region?
Okay, as far as our strategic planning, long-term view, etc., is concerned, I think that will be a little too harsh on our systems. We have systems which are slightly different from the others. Yes, we do not have a written document of a national security doctrine or national security strategy, etc. But the processes are followed. Uh, Whether the processes get implemented in the same manner as the planning, that is a question. We got Niti Ayog, we have got NSA Secretariat, we have the various institutions to do this kind of a thing. So I would not put myself into so much of a kind of a, I would say, self criticism where we undermine our system. India has grown in its own trajectory and path, and I think we are doing well for that. My important question is, observation has been over a period of my 40 years of active, 38, 39 years of active service, as also thereafter into strategic circles I've been talking, etc. My one observation has been that the military, and this is now a reflection upon our armed forces, military tends to conflate the political narrative with military narrative. See, a diplomacy has a task. Diplomacy has a task of war avoidance or keeping our national security intact without fighting the war. Okay, that is not the task of military.
Yes.
Military's task is right and square to fight. Unfortunately, we get carried away. If everything is going well in JNK, all fine, tourists are going, 3 lakh tourists have come in this year, or XYZ numbers. I'm not quoting the exact number, I'm just giving you a hypothetical situation. What happens is that the military also, military, I don't mean the army only, I mean the entire security apparatus of our country, whether it is the security forces, central police, armed forces, everybody starts to take the things on its face value. That is the place where we go wrong. As a military man, as an armed forces, our job is right and square to fight and be prepared for the worst situation. Right now, what in this discussion, I would like now comments, and thereafter we can take on the question. I will create a worst case situation, sir, and we will request the comment from both General VP and Ambassador Yogendra. The situation is like this, and it's like a war game, huh? So so I'm making the discussion a little more interesting. US and China somehow reach a agreement of going back to the Nixon era kind of a relationship. Both devise a deal, etc., to grow along with a little bit of cutbutt, right? So Pakistan and Bangladesh bandwagon on Russia, US, and China. There is some action which has taken place now. China taking advantage of all this thing. There is some action which has taken place on our northern front, and it's a situation which is more than the Galwan kind of a incident. How will now India's diplomacy kick in, and how will India's military try to deal with this situation? Now, this is a war game scenario which I have quoted. So, we will first take the diplomatic response, and then we will take the military response. And Pakistan, China, and Bangladesh, as you all know, today are converging in this particular scenario. That's the way I'm putting the scenario, because even that has been the sense which is now taking place, at least till the time Yunus and somebody like Yunus, and if Jamaat comes, the way they are going to, the way they are manipulating the entire Bangladeshi internal politics, you may not be surprised if Jamaat comes into power and ISI is pulling the strings there. After all, don't forget, at the time of partition, bulk of the army was a Pakistani trained army of Bangladesh. So their mindset is also of a similar nature. Okay, so this is the scenario, sir. I will request first Ambassador Yogendra to respond to it, and then General VP to give his military options.
Oh,
Over to
thank you
you.
very much. I think this is truly a challenge. Except that I should. So I think the question that you put, or the proposition that you put, actually contains several questions. Like you
Yes.
say, U.S. and China, they are actually having a relationship, and khatpat is going on. Now the issue is that I think it's a little more than that. Well, ultimately, it's the power dynamic within the country which actually sets the course for the foreign policy for a particular country. Now, you're right, that's possible. But in the immediate future, I'm a little doubtful. The reason basically that now the strategic competition between US and China is in terms of artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is largely the question of developing long language models, which are indigenous, which have their own sort of, let's say, category of LLMs for military security purposes. So that's a major kind of competition developing. And none of these powers, I mean, China is a aspiring power, but in the case of US, it actually wants to maintain the technology high ground. Now, how serious that competition will be and confrontation will be, we'll all have to wait and watch. I think that has become very clear, and I can see, because at the moment, as you see the framework trade agreement between US and China, it certainly tells you that the China was playing on a stronger hand, because the Chinese are controlling critical minerals. They were controlling those these, what are they called, the magnets, super magnets, whatever they're called, and therefore they were in a position to actually pressurize the US and get better terms than many other countries have actually got. So there you see that they're trying to play this kind of a situation. Now, at the same time, you have another situation, which is that the tensions are building up in the Western Pacific. That's very clear. So that's the other factor. Now, how the US decision makers will actually take a call when this kind of tension keeps building up, we don't really know. So if the situation, the relationship between them is volatile, I would actually be a little doubtful whether Pakistan or Bangladesh bandwagoning with the US or with the Chinese at the same time, or should I say alternately, it's a very, very difficult call to make. The reason, of course, is that the other factor which I mentioned is, if they're both bankrupt countries, what value do they bring to either the US or to China? And I give one example here. Again, let's take Pakistan. Again, the Pakistan. Pakistan had value when US forces were in Afghanistan. And actually, the Pakistanis actually gutted the US project in Afghanistan. ISI is the one who did it. It's very clear. But the fact of the matter is that they still had a value. Now, that is all gone now. Afghanistan is a different category of strategic issue altogether. Take the case of China. Now, I am not sure how much of the benefit the Pakistanis have got from the Chinese CPEC projects, whether it's in terms of, you know, power condition there, whether in terms of all these things being provided, economic condition, and Gwadar is a major problem for the Pakistanis. It's very clear. Now, and despite the fact that so many assurances have been given to the Chinese leader by the Pakistani armed forces, the Chinese feel insecure there. So all the dams which have been constructed in the northwest region, so dams have been stopped. So the point actually is that how much of value even China is going to see as far as Pakistan is concerned. Another example, Op Sindhu. Now, it's very clear that with the collusion that we're talking about, we had a free run of the airspace of the Pakistanis. If I'm just thinking, I don't know how the Chinese are thinking, but I'm just thinking, if I'm thinking like the Chinese, I said, what value is China for me, or Pakistan for me in military terms? If India has a free run of the airspace, an example. So what I'm trying to say, the situation, and Bangladesh, the situation actually is such that volatility is going to increase, and increasing volatility means that your options are more. And the other point, of course, is that nature of conflict now has changed. You take Ukraine, you take Gaza, or even if you take Israel-Iran conflict, it's been actually simmering for quite a while. And then there was a fortuitous inflection point because of which now they had a free run of Iran, the Israelis. Now, these long-drawn kind of conflicts Now, these long-drawn conflicts are a combination of high-tech, but also low-tech. So you're working at the entire spectrum. Now, when these long-drawn conflicts, diplomacy is never absent. You're always looking for options, openings wherever you get. And these options would always be available for us. The option we'll be able to exercise because, as I said, India, well, that's my view, that India has a value as it is. And we talk about Quad and AUKUS, but nobody talks about Malabar exercises. Yeah. I mean, Malabar is a much bigger strategic message to everybody concerned. And you know all that. So the point here is that if India remains where it is today, I'm not saying that you don't have to make sure that you have deterrence capability. You deter people and you tell whoever your adversary is that there's a cost to be paid. Now, you take a choice. You have a cost to be paid, there's a cost to be paid by you. And we are a stronger country, a more stable country, economically vibrant country, which other countries you cannot talk actually at the moment. So we are in that, not in that kind of turmoil, even as the US is, frankly, if you ask me now. I mean, from what you read, the current situation. So my point basically is that because of the nature of warfare has changed in such a way that, we can maintain the deterrence and diplomacy is always available. But my larger point has come back again is how are we doing the scenario building in that? Because that actually is very, very important. And because
Okay.
scenarios keep changing. Sorry, just 1 second. Scenarios keep changing. Who had thought Bangladesh, Sri Lanka will collapse? Who had thought Bangladesh will collapse? What were the scenarios then, and how, let's say, tenable the scenarios were? So we had to constantly keep on updating our scenario building sort of exercise, our capability, and everything that goes with it. Thank you.
Okay, so basically, my idea was not to say that this kind of a situation is likely to occur. My situation was painting a worst case scenario, which is they call it as the hedging strategy in net assessment, where this is the least likely in terms of occurrence, but it can be the worst situation for us. So that was the aim of pointing out this particular scenario. And in this
May,
scenario, basically the
may I
overview
just
was, yeah,
add a point here? Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
I'll just add the total scenario so that General VP is able to answer militarily. The US and China deconflict in South Asia to prevent escalation and protect global economic interest. Right. Both powers agree to soft pivot in the region. The US reduces overt pressure on China in South Asia in exchange of cooperation in global matters, climate, trade, stability, Ukraine, etc. Pakistan leverages detent, reinvents itself as a regional pivot, push for a diplomatic equivalence with India, escalates pressure on Kashmir under the cover of neutrality from both great powers, and China takes an advantage of this particular normalization with the US to carry out something on our northern borders. So now this is something which is a scenario which is possible, feasible in case China's economy, as we know, is not doing well. Americans are also not very, very well off. Their debt is almost the highest debt in the world. Just because they can print the dollar, they are able to sustain their 36 or 37 billion dollar debt. So therefore, in such a scenario, advantage can be taken by our so-called Western neighbor, and the rest everybody. Normally, what happens in such a scenario, everybody starts jumping in, whosoever who wants to sort out its problem. So, because of that, I said this is for a Indian military the worst situation. So, how do we go about this? That was my explanation of the situation which I wanted to paint at that time.
Just very quickly, this point. I
Yeah.
think this is a good scenario that you have painted. My only thing is basically I can say, of course, you cannot be prepared for every scenario. It's impossible.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, you have to think about power asymmetry, where even a weaker power is in a position to impose cost on the stronger power for them to think twice, 3 times, 4 times to take a decision. Like take the North Korea and US, one example. So the point here is basically this, that if you analyze the way the conflict dynamic in South Asia, I would say, let us say from 1948 onwards, different major powers have come in pursuing their own interests. But in many ways, because of our diplomatic, what should I say, nimble-footedness, fleet-footedness, so to say, we've been able to manage the situation, well so far. So even, for example, if we take the Operation Sindoor, the post-Pahalgam massacre, how actually the diplomacy was active throughout. It was active before Sindoor was launched. And if you read the newspapers, there aren't
That's
foreign
that's why
minister.
that's why I was asking. Yeah, that's why I was asking what are the options for India in diplomatically in this kind of a scenario. So we'll come
So
back to that. We'll come back to that, sir.
okay.
After Jan VP because he's
Okay.
out of this
Yeah.
discussion for quite some time. Sir,
Okay,
Jan
sure.
VP, sir, this is by far the worst scenario as far as military is concerned. So how do you think we should deal with it? Suppose you get a call from the political leadership. Look, you have to sort it out. So
Yeah.
how do you do it?
Okay, so firstly, I hope I am not disappointing you when I say that perhaps we are making things oversimplistic when we are trying to sketch a picture like this, that everybody ganged up against India and we are going to be sorted out by this, that, or whatever
Not
it is.
everybody, sir. Not everybody. I have
Yeah.
not.
So
I have not. I've
let me
only
come
said
to
three.
this. Let
I've
me
only
come to
said
this.
four people,
Yeah,
four
yeah. So
countries.
let me
I've
come
not
to
said
that.
everybody. Say.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm coming to that. So before that, I'll just connect it with two other points,
Yeah.
which you had mentioned earlier, that you attributed that it is diplomats' job to avoid war and it is military's job to fight war. Let me take your mind back to Chanakya, who says the biggest victory is when you win the war without firing a single shot. And the good
Absolutely.
army is that army which remains prepared, creates massive deterrence, ensure that nobody looks at you to fight a war. So the war
Yes.
avoidance is not just that those tools. War avoidance is also, आपने एक दिनकर की कविता सुनाई थी, तो उसका ही एक है कि if you are strong, your deterrences are strong, nobody will fight with you. To avoid war is be
That's right.
prepared to fight a war. So that is the role of military. Not that every time there is a war, so you start firing. No, the good military, strong military, smart military make sure that nothing is required to be fired. Your size and shape and posture itself deters people not to fight war. That is one point. The second point I wanted to make about the influence. There was some discussion which some time back. To my mind, our policy has always been, and perhaps we'll do very well, to rise as a gentle giant, a big India, a benign India, which causes no harm, no threat to anyone. If India can rise like that, it will be the most respected, powerful, and benign power. That's the perhaps the dream of our forefathers. This is how India should rise, not like North Korea or China or anybody else threatening everybody. Now, coming to the picture that you have painted, let me come to the final outcome of that scenario, that India was defeated in detail because the two nuclear powers are ganged up against India, and Bangladesh is also doing whatever it can. Now, just imagine the world next morning after India's catastrophic defeat with the hands of China, Pakistan, and whatever else you have mentioned. What will be the world like? And you think that America or the Western power or the rest of the globe will be happy with that kind of geography, that kind of a global order where India is just not there? Firstly. Second, we have witnessed for the last 2.5 years a non-nuclear power, Ukraine, is fighting with Russia, a nuclear power. What has happened? Nothing. You have seen a ragtag army like Hamas is fighting with Israel and America both. We have seen Iran fighting with America. So this defeat in detail is a huge, huge misconception. A country, when it fights on its own land, very, very difficult to defeat. Who gets defeated? The interventionist powers. Those who go and start interfering in others' affairs, be it America interfering in Afghanistan, or be it some colonial powers interfering in Vietnam and other places long back. None of those interventions succeed. But the country which fights for its own existence, survival, very difficult to defeat. That's one point. Second, in this particular scenario, what we are looking at is almost half the world's nuclear power. 3 countries involved: China, India, and Pakistan. And the rest of the world is watching. Can't happen. So what happens is when this kind of scenario is painted, it is a very, very different and very complex situation. And then that mute question, why do we have the nuclear weapons? If these people can come around and kick us whenever they want and wherever they want, worst case or good case scenario, it cannot happen. I'm very, very categorical about it. This is literally being taken as an existential threat. Okay, jump from here, go to the definition of world war. What is the world war, or when is the world war going to be fought if not in this scenario? When two nuclear power is pressing the third country and rest of the world is watching, where the diplomacy, Ambassador Yogendra just mentioned about it. So it's not that's worst case or good case scenario. Now, having said all that, let me come to the military dimensions. The war in high Himalayas is a very tough battle. War in Kashmir is a very tough battle. Here, people are, after 2 days, started talking about when is the ceasefire. In Himalayas, if the war has to be actually fought with China, it is going to take ages. And no decision is going to come from there, purely from the military point of view. Now, let's look at Pakistan. It is one thing to say Pakistan will attack India and start fighting. What about their economy? For $1 billion, they have gone to IMF 25th time. You think they can survive or sustain a war like that? Then let's look at the history. When China was battling with, or India was fighting with China in 1962 war, what was Pakistan doing? Why didn't they interfere? To give, and Kashmir cause was there, very much there, which is supposed to be their jugular vein. It cannot be. I mean, those things cannot possibly happen when you have this kind of scenario when people are just getting together and starting resolving things. We also say that that India, as a very, very respected and strong power, rising power, has a great influence, not only on the region, but in the world community. And we are just getting little hyper and little sensitive about that something happened post-Sindoor and Pakistan has not gone to the world, they have won the war and this, that, kind of thing. No. Just wait for another 3 months and you will see the scenario ironing out. We have just seen the BRICS statement coming out. India refused to sign joint statement in SCO. So we have the power, we have the strength, we have the staying power. And we are also a military power where these kind of situations are very tricky, very difficult. But if we look at, even those adversaries, if they look at the history and they look at our capacity to sustain war, I mean, Pakistan, they have fought 5 wars. How many? 5 times they have fought with us. How many wars have they won? None. So they are happy in making somebody a field marshal having lost the war. So let them be happy with that. So point is, I'm just concluding it, that militarily, a scenario like that is very, very difficult. I can't even visualize. And if it happens, the dimensions are going to be very different. It's basically a nuclear country being attacked by 2 nuclear powers, which is an unacceptable scenario in every way of
Absolutely, sir. Your point is taken. I think you misunderstood the situation which I had painted. You should have you should have heard what I had said. I didn't say they had started for a war. I said there was a khatpat, a conflict of the kind of Galwan type, which I had mentioned as far as China was concerned, and some incidents on the Pakistani front. The whole idea of creating this situation was that you do not have the leverage of 2 major powers. So diplomatically, what will you do? Militarily, what will you do to ensure that your capabilities remain well, to be prepared for any eventuality militarily? That was my point which I was trying to get.
Okay,
unfortunately, you took it. Unfortunately, you took it to nuclear war and full-fledged war. No, I never said that.
War because this khatpat, once you start the khatpat, now it is in nobody's control to keep it at khatpat. Khatpat can go anywhere. Wars, there is a saying that it is very easy to start a war, but very difficult to terminate. So khatpat can start, but thereafter, where it will end, nobody knows.
My point was very simple. It was a low-level conflict which was taking place on the Chinese thing, and which was on the Pakistani side. They also took advantage of this, and they were trying to get back to whatever they have suffered since. And you, sir, there are some people who are very, very rational, and there are some people who are not rational at all. Pakistan falls into that category. Otherwise, by getting defeated every time, yet they come and do something stupid, which means that there is this element of irrationality. Pakistan is always known as they are rational in being irrational. That's the way I look at Pakistan, and I think we should be prepared for such a kind of a behavior from Pakistan. I won't say the same for China, but definitely for Pakistan, one has to be prepared because it is in their psyche. वो जो हमारा पश्तून वाली का जो कल्चर होता है ना, that culture will remain in their blood. So we should be prepared for a military option. I'm not saying that we are going to fight. We are not going to pick up a fight, but if you're not ready for a fight, then I think we are doing a mistake. And what is the meaning of ready? What is the meaning of being ready for a fight? Which means that our intelligence has to be well, our entire military preparedness has to be of a level where that in case if you're called, and I say again, in case if you're called, not that military is saying ki, okay, every military tries to have a situation of a conventional deterrence and a nuclear deterrence, but has everyone been deterred by these things? Have wars ended? That is the reality which we have to understand, sir. There is a very famous saying, and it's not a saying, it has been said by Charles Tilly, and Ambassador Yogendra would probably know about it. Nations make war and wars make nations. It's a reality, sir. It's a this thick book. Please read it. I mean, we cannot. The human nature is to fight from the day one. पहले वो पत्थर से लड़ते थे, फिर बो से लड़ते थे, फिर डायनामाइट से लड़ते थे, फिर टैंक से लड़ते थे. Then they went to the air. Then they went to space, missiles. This will continue. This kind of a confrontation in human society will continue till we go to the apocalyptic situation. So my point was that we as military people must do our own job. The diplomatic guys must do their own job. Politicians must do their own job. This is something which we need to be in harmony with. That हर एक का काम उसी को शोभा देता है. That was my point. That was the overall thing, sir. Otherwise, I am in full agreement that this kind of a situation is very rare to happen. But then I had left out Russia out of it, sir. I had left out certain things deliberately to create that option of a diplomatic discussion and a military discussion. That which would have been the options for us to keep our military preparedness on board. Which all countries which we could have taken assistance of. How much of an indigenization we could have achieved, let's say in these 2-3 years when this kind of a scenario had happened. So my whole idea of discussion was that. Of course, it got hijacked to a different level, but I'm happy that all these points came about, sir. A final word from Ambassador Yogendra, and then we will call it a conclusion, sir, for this show, sir. But it was a very interesting thing. I deliberately put that particular situation, so there is this, the YouTube becomes a little more exciting, sir. People, yes, sir.
I just want to make one point. Of course, scenario building is a very difficult exercise, and one has to understand that nobody can ever draw a perfect scenario. You know it better than anybody else does.
Yes.
But as I said, this capacity, the analytical capacity kept on getting better, and I can put it in two, 3 points. I think 2-3 benchmarks, I will say. First of all, when the nature of wars India has fought so far. What has been the external dimension of that war? And to what extent, and the external dimension means what other countries have been looking at the outcome and the development of that war. You have China on one side, Russia on one side, US on the other side, Japan, and so on and so forth, and every country. So they have a certain interest. And I cannot imagine that all the countries' interests will align in such a way that they will say, okay, the scenario which has just been drawn before us, actually let's just take place. That's one point. The second point, of course, and that means that you have to look at a historical thing. And the second thing, the nature of warfare as it's developing now. I mean, that again, you are a better judge than I am. But as I can see that now, more than ever, diplomacy is part of not only to prevent the war, but part of actually seeing as to how the war can be managed with the intervention of, developing our leverages, exploiting our leverage with other countries, depending upon what the interests are. That's the second point. The third point is that every country, and this is a continuing exercise, every country has a pain threshold. How much pain is Pakistan prepared to take when it engages in a war with us? How much pain is China prepared to take when engaged in war with us? How much pain are we prepared to take when we engage in a war? So all that, and that means that you actually do an analysis of the internal situation, whether it's India, whether it's Pakistan or China or whichever country, or Russia or US and all that. Now, I just give you one, I leave with just one example. You see, when Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif said publicly that 2 o'clock in the morning, Chief of the Army Staff called me to say that Noor Khan has been attacked. I just thought in my mind that why is he saying that publicly? I understood that to mean that he's saying it publicly to say that the Chief of the Army Staff is not doing a good job as the Army Chief, number one. Then the signal interpreted by the Chief of the Army Staff differently. He said, well, I'll promote myself as Field Marshal. Right. Then when he goes to US, it's very interesting. The Pakistan military issued a press statement. What does it say? First of all, in that meeting, or whatever, we can discuss those interests. Who's present in the meeting? Chief of the Army Staff and the lunch. DGISI, President, Secretary of State, and their Director CIA. That's all. Everybody's out. And the Pakistan press release actually says, Pakistan Army's press release, the two leaders met and discussed, etc., and how to cooperate. I mean, just think about it. What is Shehbaz Sharif thinking? He says that the Chief of the Army Staff is saying two leaders have discussed this. It shows to me that there is a kind of friction developing between the political leadership and the military leadership. It's very clear. Now, that itself suggests a very different dynamic inside Pakistan itself. Now, is that dynamic going to lead to stability in Pakistan so that we can think about various scenarios or not? That's my basic thought on this. And of course, as I said, the Pakistan, the economic condition is dire, its political condition is dire, right? A fragile country, let's put it like that, a fragile country's capacity to fight a decisive war is limited to that extent. And that requires, it's a matter of assessment. It's not going to stay like that for the next 100 years. It is simply that now, in the near to medium term, that's the situation that's going to be. So my larger point is that, when we draw up any scenario for conflict or for international relations of India with other countries, we actually, in my view, I think you have to think about some of these scenarios. Some of these factors. Thank you.
Yes, sir. So final comments by you, and then we conclude the session, sir.
No, I have. I think I've already overshot my position, but the comments are very simple. That military engagements are something which are most, I think, in today's scenario, are most undesirable engagements.
Absolutely,
and
no doubt about it.
Any political leader, any visionary political leader anywhere sitting around the world would have seen the futility of military engagements with the 3-4 major conflicts which are going around the world. It gives you nothing but destruction in every which way. So to my mind, jumping out to a military scenario with no proper end state in mind will be a very foolish thing for any country to embark upon. That's number one point. Number 2 point, the capacity of the states to sustain war. Ambassador has mentioned, and I've also said it earlier, fortunately for us, at least our lower periphery is surrounded by the states like you mentioned about Bangladesh, Pakistan and all that. They are all very, very fragile economies, very fragile, very small countries, so not so much of threat. Coming to China, the final point that I want to make, I was listening to a very interesting podcast by Ambassador Vijay Gokhale just the other day, and he mentioned about this, he dissected actually the Galwan incident, and his point was very simple, the Chinese perhaps tested their armies. They, the last war that they fought was the Vietnam War, short while. After that, for 50 years, they haven't fought a war. So while they may be looking very good on paper, but if I am Xi Jinping, I'm not very happy. I'm not very sure whether when they are put to test, will they come out victorious or not. So China actually is thinking a lot before committing for the price that they are actually looking for. That is, I'm talking about the Taiwan not going there, but they were trying to test out their military against India. And I think they must have got the message also very clear. So even going by these past examples of our periphery and also what is happening around the world, war is a very, very serious business. And final point about that irrationality, it reminds me of a small joke. A little kid was throwing stones at everybody's window panes. So somebody said, "ये क्या हो रहा है?" कहता है, "ये बच्चा है, छोटा है, पागल है, ऐसे ही मारता रहता है." But they suddenly found that except for his own house, he was pelting stone everywhere else. दूसरे को वहां क्यों नहीं मार रहा? कहता है, इतना भी पागल नहीं है. So same is the case with these wars. So this General Saab in Pakistan, they may be very irrational, but within that they also know they also have to live for long and carry on sapping the poor state of Pakistan. To leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roshan. You can conclude the session.
No, I would just say this much: it was a very interesting discussion, and when we do net assessment and when we build a scenario, you always have most likely scenario, and the least likely scenario, and all your preparations are done accordingly. So nothing is that it cannot be happening. So I found it a lot of thought is there in it, and we can ponder about it. And I would just like to thank all the three panelists for an excellent podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, DP sir. Thank you, Ambassador Yogendra. I think we have tested the thing against the worst case type of a scenario, and that is what is required also. That is also required so that people get to know what is going to be the reality. And we have touched the 100 marks, sir, thanks to the scenario building. This is probably the highest in the last few days. There were 100 people listening to you. There were 100 people listening to you live. You don't even get them in the seminars also. And thanks a lot.
I hope we can.
कुछ बोल रहे